All right. What is going on, everybody? Happy Monday. Welcome back to another episode of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours here. We've got a little bit of a DFS holiday of sorts today with the MLB All-Star break going on. We've got the home run derby going on here tonight, but one of those rare days where the lobbies for fantasy sites look a little thin. Maybe everybody's here kind of taking a day off or whatever. If this is your first time watching the stream, I know we are continuing to get new viewers here every single day, so thank you for tuning in, first of all. But this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, about really whatever you guys want to talk about. I get questions in from YouTube chat, from our Office Hours channel on Slack, and from our email inbox, support@sabersim.com. So if you are interested in asking a question to be answered on the show, those are the best three routes to do it. I am live here for a reason, because I do want live questions being asked here of me live on the show. I want you guys to be a part of the conversation. If you have some thoughts about a topic that we're talking about, feel free to fire them off into really YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel on Slack. Those are probably the best channels for the live interaction here. But let's see. If you are not already in the Slack community, the description of this video and all past Office Hours videos will have a link to join our Slack community. There's awesome conversation going on there every day. A lot of the interesting topics that we talk about here on the show either kind of start grassroots in some of the channels in our Slack channel, or there's sometimes some interesting follow-up after the show too that takes place where people are kind of continuing the conversation in Slack. So highly recommend joining up. I host this show every weekday, Monday through Friday, here at 2 p.m. Eastern. Once a week, we've been using this time slot for what we've been calling a strategy session, where I'm joined typically by a few other people from the SaberSim team, and we break down a specific DFS sport or contest type or topic or whatever is really pertinent for that given week. And this week, with the MLB All-Star break ending on Thursday, we are kicking back off the second half of the baseball season with a single game showdown between the Red Sox and Yankees on Thursday. That will probably have some decent sized contests. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people playing that. And then DraftKings has also been promoting pretty heavily a MLB showdown contest for Sunday night of this week that is also between the Red Sox and the Yankees. I know DraftKings has been doing satellites for that contest, and it looks like the contest sizes are probably going to be pretty big for that. So a bit of an opportunity to dive into MLB Showdown. So that is going to be the topic of our strategy session here for this week. We're pretty excited about that. I believe we're actually going to host that on Wednesday of this week at 2 p.m. Eastern, since that game is on Thursday evening. Want to make sure everybody has time to watch that. So it should be a lot of fun as the week goes on. If you have questions for baseball Showdown specific content, feel free to fire them off into the Office Hours channel in Slack or email us, and we are pretty excited about that. The past few weeks, we've been really focused on the baseball content, given that it is that time of year. So I've said it over and over again here on Office Hours, and I will continue to say it. The last three videos we have done for strategy sessions are really great baseball content. If you've been playing baseball hard, I highly recommend checking them out. That starts with the how our baseball model works, where I had Matt and Will on here talking about the improvements we made to the model this season, all the things that are going on there. And then Max was on with me here 2 weeks in a row, where we first talked about 5 strategies that winning DFS players take on SaberSim, really just a breakdown of editing projections, editing exposures, editing ownership, different ways that you can add some additional value to the app and get builds that are a little bit more unique to you. And then also last week, Max was here on again, and we were talking about finding the right stacks in MLB DFS, really acting that video kind of serves the role of being the why to the previous videos how, right? First, we taught here's how to edit projections, here's how to edit exposures, here's the effect that those things have on your build, right? Last week, we more talked about different strategies that you can use SaberSim as a research tool for to figure out where some of maybe those high upside, lower owned stacks are. And then you can, of course, apply the strategies that we discussed in the previous video to get some of those teams in your builds and things like that. So Anyway, it looks like I'll be having a pretty busy day here. We've got quite a few questions. We've had some trickle in through Slack. We have, of course, a few that have come in our support channels in email. So I will just dive right in here in a moment. I will just remind you guys again, if you have questions as I'm walking through any of this stuff here today, feel free to fire it off. If there's anything confusing, anything that you'd like a little bit of clarification on or anything like that, or just want to be a part of the conversation, right? That's great. Fire off your questions and comments here in the chat channel. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in here. I'm going to first talk about a few questions that came in from Sean. Sean had a couple questions here on Friday. We talked about it, and there was a bit of follow-up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually tackle both of these questions at the same time because they're very related. They're all related really to step 3 of the lineup building process here. So Sean asked, during the selection of lineups that SaberSim has built, do you have to manually click through and discard the lineups that you don't want? And then 2, once I've selected, say, 150 out of the 500 lineups, is there a feature or tool to see the amount of exposure I've selected on one player, or will the My Exposure tab just auto-populate as you work your way through discarding lineups? So let's go ahead and pull this up here. We'll do a quick kind of demo of that step 3 here and talk about some of this stuff. But Sean, it sounds like basically what you assumed was happening here is accurate. You've got a pretty good read on it. So we'll run a build here. This is for yesterday's baseball slate. So I will just go ahead. I'm going to adjust 2 projections here now so that we don't see that message when it pops up. And let's let this build run, and then we'll talk about a few things here. Give this just a moment here. And I actually didn't play this slate. I was out of town yesterday. So interested to kind of see what pops here. I don't actually have a lot of context for how the slates played out yesterday. My All-Star break started a little bit early. Just give this a little bit longer here. I want a nice full pool to answer this question. Okay, so first question here, really, the answer to this first question is no, you do not need to manually go through and click and discard lineups unless you want to, right? That is a strategy you can employ here. So what we're doing is we're building a pool of 500 lineups, and then we are floating to the top the best 20 sorted by SaberScore, which is a calculation made based on your sliders to determine what the best lineups are that take into account correlation, ownership, and upside. Right. So we're automatically going to give you our favorite 20 here. You can go through and remove lineups by unchecking this. It will disappear from your My Lineups tab here. If you don't like these lineups, this is a viable strategy of tightening up your lineup pool, especially if maybe if you're playing a smaller pool, first of all, if you're only playing anywhere from 1 to 20 or so lineups, I think this can make some sense. Alternatively, if you are maybe just cherry picking a few lineups that you don't really like for one reason or another to remove, I think this can make a lot of sense. If you click fill lineups back to 20, it will give you the next lineups in the pool, excluding the ones you just unchecked. And regarding the question here of once you've selected the lineups that you're happy with here, so let's remove a few others, these exposures are updating in real time. So the second question here, I think from Sean was, is there a feature to see the amount of exposure you've selected on one player? It does auto-populate, right? So this is, you can see these exposures are changing. This is live. This is showing you what you have actually in your set of lineups that for your player exposures. So works all really well together, should be pretty seamless. I would say one thing to experiment with here, Sean, if you have been going through and manually looking at lineups and deciding if you want to play them and unchecking them. If not, and that is working for you, great. I would say you can also edit these exposures live here. So say we only wanted 50% of Berrios. We can go ahead and actually just set that exposure here, and it will adjust the lineups we are getting to make sure we have no more than 50% Berrios in our 20 lineups in our 20 lineups, right? So it'll find the right lineups in the 500 pool, sorted by SaberScore to make sure that those exposures are met. So a lot of power here overall. The beauty of this whole thing is that we can do all of this without having to create any new lineups, right? That is why part of the reason why we build 500 to begin with. So great questions there. And as you are kind of continuing to play around here in step 3, getting familiar, let me know if there are any other questions that come up. But I think those are pretty well covered there. So, and then there was another question that came in here, and this was from James here in support as well, and we'll talk about this. And he said, let's say I am really focused on the Yankees offense doing well today. Would it not make sense to play the 2:10 slate because it is smaller than the 1:05 p.m. slate? So again, this isn't a slate I played, but I did do a little bit of looking back here to take a look and just get a little bit of an idea of the overall slate context. I think there are there's definitely some nuance here to this kinds of question. I think when I originally read this, I read it from the perspective of which slate maybe does it make more sense to play the Yankees on. But now I'm seeing that this is more about what slate doesn't make sense to play. I will say, so one thing here, I mean, just looking at this, the way I'm kind of seeing what the slate looked like from yesterday, the Yankees were kind of one of those middle run total teams. I know it looks like Valdez was pitching for Houston, who's a pretty decent pitcher, not one of our highest projected run total teams overall. So one thing to think about here is we were talking about this internally a little bit, and I was talking about this with Ross actually, and he made the point that the way he would approach this question would be that on the 105 slate with 11 games on the slate, the ownership of the Yankees stack overall is likely to be even lower, or is likely to be lower than it is on a 5-game turbo slate, right? So you are going to get less absolute ownership on the stack. If you really wanted to play that team, you may get some increased relative edge on the field by playing them on a slate where players have so many other teams to choose from, right? I think the interesting caveat to that argument is that even if on the 5 p.m. turbo, for example, which doesn't look like it, there it is. Oh, so it looks like, again, I was out yesterday. It looks like maybe one of the games got postponed. So maybe this actually ended up playing as a 4-game slate here. On the 4-game version of the slate, right? Even if the Yankees end up with more absolute ownership than they do on the 11-game slate, they may actually have less relative ownership if the field is gravitating towards some of the better plays on the slate, right? Or the higher projected plays on the slate, right? It may be that the Twins or something like that were soaking up a ton of hitting ownership. And even if the Yankees bats were a little bit more owned in absolute terms, right? And we can actually see this here. So Yankees, actually, let's do it this way, right? We see Yankees on the turbo, maybe an average of 18 or so projected ownership per player on the turbo slate, looking at the top players, and on the 11-game slate, let's see. Looks like closer to like 8. That 18 points of, or that those players that are projected at 18% projected ownership may be relatively lower than the average ownership per player than the 8% ownership is on the main slate. So I think there's kind of two sides to the coin here. I would say some additional nuance here ends up being obviously the size of the contest you're going to play. Main slates typically have much bigger contests. Turbos have a little bit smaller contests where our need to get really different on the field is a little bit lower. I think the most interesting way to answer this question would be to go back to the strategy we had talked about in the strategy session from last week and run one of those upside builds where we are turning off the impacts of ownership fade and turning up the impacts of smart diversity to 10 here, right? And when we run this build, I would run this build for both slates and see how viable the builder thinks the Yankees are as a stack for both slates, right? And I think it may give you an idea of where the better slate to play it is, right? What this build is going to do is it's going to say, it's going to give us an image of what maybe optimal lineups that actually could win the contest end up being. I saw Andrew, quick question came in here. Are you running the upside build as cash or GPP? I use the GPP builder or the GPP settings to set the sliders. So style GPP. And then once this build is done, I'll show you. But I turn ownership fade all the way off and I turn smart diversity all the way up, right? It gives us an image of what optimal lineups that could win the contest might look like. And then we can get an idea of like how popular Yankees are as a viable play. So, and then we can even look at maybe more than just our 20 and get an idea. So the Yankees look like a pretty viable overall stack here. Andrew said 20 max or 3 max here. I'll go ahead and show you my build setting. So I think if I were actually doing this, when I do this for my own research process, what I'm actually typically doing is setting my sliders at 150 here. And then I turn ownership fade off and I turn smart diversity all the way up to 10. One thing to note, interesting point here, is that we've had this question on office hours here before. These drop downs don't actually do anything beyond just setting these sliders in a certain place, right? So it's not as if we set, for example, this 5, 0, 10 as a way to run an upside build, but the drop down is set at 20 max versus a 150 max where we go 5, 0, 10. These have the same impact on your build, right? So these are just the settings I like to use. When I'm actually doing it for my research, what I'll do is typically use the 150 max settings, turn ownership fade off, turn smart diversity all the way up, and build 150 so that I get 1500. But on office hours, typically I end up just doing the 500 lineup build so it gets done a little bit faster. But I like to have the flexibility of seeing a bigger pool when I'm doing this on my own. But anyway, I think what's interesting here is we do see the Yankees show up as a pretty viable stack overall. The builder seems to be pretty willing to use them. They show up in a lot of optimals. Let's try it out of curiosity and see what it looked like for the 11-game slate. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. And taking this question in a little bit more of a generic way, right? This is kind of getting at the heart of what that strategy session was about with Max and I, right? This user here had probably something in his research process overall led him to the Yankees. Maybe there was a signal or something that he felt like the model was missing, or a lot of DFS players were going to discount, or maybe was doing some research and another sharp MLB DFS player put him onto the Yankees, right? And you have this idea of, I kind of want to see the viability of that stack overall. This is exactly part of what is powerful behind this, right? It allows you, by looking at real possible lineups that could be optimal lineups for the contests, how viable is that, right? And if the Yankees then didn't pop at all in this bigger build and you still wanted to roll with them, that's totally fine. I think at that point you'd be wanting to go into step 1 and bumping up their team total projection or something like that. But we're right now kind of using this more as a tool of cross-checking our initial individual research against what the builder wants to do. So let's go ahead and take a look now and see how this comes out. So the Yankees end up still, obviously these numbers are all going to be probably a little bit lower since there's just less games on the slate, but they're still probably the 4th most viable stack. It seems like, honestly, this was probably just a pretty, I don't know what happened yesterday with hindsight. This to me seems like actually probably what would have been a pretty sharp play in both slates at this point, right? They had a 4.4 implied run total. I imagine they probably weren't overwhelmingly chalky. I don't know, maybe if Vegas was higher on them or than us or what, but it seems like that actually probably would have been a pretty sharp play overall, right? They show up as the 2nd highest stacked team in the turbo slate and the 4th highest stacked team in the 11-game main slate. Seems like a pretty sharp approach. I think they were probably viable. Let's go back to the question here so people can kind of know what we're talking about here. I think they were viable in both slates. I think they seem to have shown up in slightly more optimal lineups in the turbo slate, but a lot of that might just be because there were less games overall. But really sharp question, pretty interesting one to think about there. So Hopefully that was helpful. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and keep cranking along here. I actually thought I had one other question. I don't remember where I saw this question, but I swear I saw it. So I'm actually just going to answer it because it's quick. So this question was about resetting sliders to defaults. So we had a user that watched the video that I keep referring to here about running these upside stacks and then was struggling to kind of get sliders back to their default settings. The easiest way to do that is to just go ahead and move these drop downs back around, and they will just snap back to whatever they were before. One thing that can be difficult, I know we do have a few sports like CSGO here where we don't have the slider drop downs. Let me make sure that CSGO is one of those before I say that. But we do have a few of these sports where we don't have the contest-specific slider drop downs, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to know where the defaults go. I would say this is kind of a known hole here that we plan on resolving here in a future update. But for now, it may just be useful to take a quick mental snapshot of where these sliders are before you start moving them around, just so you know where the defaults are. You could also always back up to a previous day's slate and get an idea of about where the sliders should be set, right? So if we had set the sliders differently for this particular slate and we go back, we can go ahead and pull back a previous build, and it should give you the defaults for that particular contest. I think you could also do a hard refresh. Control-Shift-R might go ahead and refresh that slider setting for you. So, but for most of the major sports where we have those drop downs for the different contests, you can just go ahead and change those over, and that will bring you back to the defaults. So. All right, let's go ahead and keep us cruising here. Another really sharp question that had come in here. So I'm going to go ahead. Now we're on over to Slack. This question came in from Shiver Me Ginger here. And he said, hi all, for the next office hours, can we talk about using late swap effectively? Example, you have a 3-man Milwaukee stack that is doing poorly versus Cincinnati. You have the Dodgers as a 5-man and would be pretty well owned, along with, say, Peralta and Musgrove. Ideally, you want to move off the Dodgers chalk and perhaps Musgrove to give yourself a chance. How can you at all isolate that stack using late swap without messing up your other lineups that are fine and you want to keep? Say this is a 20-man and you want to change 3 of your 20 lineups. You don't want to impact the other 17. I've been thinking a lot about this question this morning. First of all, this is a really sharp idea, right? And I think it's something that myself included, part of the reason why, well, let me back up. I think this is something that myself included, players don't really do often enough, right? Really talking about maximizing and squeezing out every edge you can find in your DFS play. It makes a lot of sense if you have a lineup that is doing poorly to aggressively pivot off the chalk where you can, with the hopes that you get some lower ownership upside guys. And even if that lineup doesn't come back to win, it maybe comes back and finds some min cash equity or something like that. I think the other side of that, and probably the side that is a bit more important for everyone to do, is when you do have a lineup that's really high up in the standings overall, it can be useful to sometimes maybe even pivot onto, or let's put it this way. If your lineups are doing really well, they're at the top of the contest, you're maybe 75% away through the slate, and you have a lot of lower owned plays that have already done really well, and you've kind of captured the upside condition of your leverage plays in the lineup, it can make some sense to pivot onto more chalky plays in the rest of the lineup to maximize your potential to take that contest down. I think there's a lot of nuance here. It depends, one, on how top heavy the contest is, right? Even if you were in the top 1% halfway through the slate, if 40% of the cash is going to first, it makes sense to still play in a really leveraged way, and so on. But I do think this is a sharp point overall. The difficulty here is in how actually usable or the best way to handle this in your actual lineups is. I would say in general, the kind of most utilitarian approach here of being the most useful for the greatest number of slates, I think it would probably be useful for you to get an idea of what your lineup composition looked like overall and be willing to take some broader stroke approaches to handling this, right? So let me go ahead and pull up my build again here. Actually, let's run the 12. Let's look at the 1206 one because that's the one with default settings. And I'm going to switch this back to 20, see what we're getting, and think about kind of some hypotheticals of how I might use this. So okay, so let's just look at this here. Let's say we were playing this and we were heavily invested into Philly, like it looks like we would have been, who was presumably a fairly chalky team. And were they an early game on the slate? They were an early game on the slate. And let's say they were failing to meet expectations or something like that, or failed to meet expectations. And you had your late swap opportunity here at 12-10 and you wanted to make some pivots. Maybe if your later stacked teams were Minnesota or something like that, and you were playing pretty chalky overall, Minnesota and Houston or something like that. I think one thing that can make a lot of sense if it looks like your lineups in general are heading towards missing the min cash, or you're certainly not going to win that slate. I think you can be justified in bringing down maybe some of the higher total teams, reducing your ownership to the chalky plays in the late slate, and bumping up the team totals of teams that less players are going to be on in an effort to get a little bit different and increase your min cash equity on your lineups overall in the late slate, right? And I said we're talking about kind of generally here from the standpoint of, I know this question was very specific about being very precise and late swapping exactly 3 lineups. I think it can be useful maybe to just treat your lineup portfolio as a closed system, get an idea of how you are doing on the slate overall, how the plays you were most heavily exposed to are doing overall, and what that means for most of your lineups, and then late swap from here. If you want to be very surgical with the way you're handling your lineups, I think the best thing you could do, right, is to download your template file and just re-upload the lineups that you actually do want to edit, right? That's going to require some work. I don't have an entry file for the slate again, but say you downloaded your entry file and you were only playing 20 lineups, and you're hopefully maybe just playing those lineups in 3 contests or one single 20 lineup contest. You could just remove the lines that have the lineups that you don't want to touch, upload it, and the late swap will only late swap the lineups that you've imported, right? That's probably the easiest way to be really surgical here with just your few lineups. You could also obviously do this by hand. I think it's a little bit trickier. You lose the value of using the tool for this. But I think probably the most common approach of what most people do around the industry when they're trying to accomplish this goal is to just do some typical late swaps by hand to maybe get a little bit chalkier or a little less chalkier depending on how you're doing in the contest. I think the final note I'll make on this before I move us along is to, in general, be a little bit careful. And it was actually kind of funny. I saw this question roll in over the weekend, and then an hour later, I saw Shiver Me Ginger said, "Wow, looks like a really bad example now, but I hope you get my point." Baseball is kind of tricky, right? One home run and a player someone's 0 for 3 in their last at bat of the night, they get a home run and they're a spectacular value play at that point per dollar. Baseball is really tricky, right? It's difficult to know how your lineups are doing if any of the games in your lineup are still in progress, right? There's big swings. Part of the impact of having most of the scoring for any given hitter in particular take place on a very small amount of plays overall, right? Like one 3 RBI double is maybe somebody's all their points they're scoring that slate, right? And they score that all on one player, one big home run or something like that, right? It's very hard to know how your lineups are doing. So be careful with this. I would say if you are treating a player or a stack as kind of a failure and saying, okay, my fairly chalky big stack didn't go off, I need to get different in the rest of your lineup. If you're making that statement, make sure that player's game is probably done first, because you never know when that 8th inning rally is going to come and the whole stack's going to get on base and get RBIs and things like that. In a sport like basketball, I think you can be a little bit more aware and intelligently aware of where your lineups actually stand in the contest overall, and take advantage of this a little bit more. I also think it can be a little bit more flexible too, with less of an importance on stacking, right? If your big 5-man stack failed to go off or had a poor performance, a lot of times that can kind of just be a lineup that's sunk even to min cash. But that would be kind of my overall take there. So in summary, right, for baseball, first of all, in reverse order here, be careful because baseball is super variant. Things change quickly. A lineup that you may think is not doing very well, that even just has a few innings left, may end up getting a spike. And you don't necessarily, I mean, I guess you could always late swap back, but just be careful with doing this too early. I would say in general, the easiest way and the way that's going to be most useful for the greatest number of slates is to treat your lineups as a complete set. Get an idea of where your lineups have failed or succeeded overall, especially on your highest owned plays, and then adjust accordingly. And if you want to be very surgical with only editing a select few lineups, you can edit your CSV that you get from DraftKings, remove the other lineups that are in your lineup pool, and just re-upload the lineups that you actually want to late swap and use the late swapper from there, and then get very, very precise with the way that you are adjusting projections on players and things like that from there. But great question. Definitely something interesting to talk about, and definitely some higher level late swap strategy that I think will prove useful and be something that we are talking about fairly often when we get back into NBA season. So, but all right, cool. I'm going to keep us cruising along here. Another question that came in over the weekend in our Office Hours channel. This is from DIY Guy. He said, if you upload your own projections, which are normally based on a single upcoming game, in lieu of using SaberSim projections based on thousands of sims, how does that impact the use of the sliders and or the SaberSim score? That is a great question. I would say let's go ahead and reset everything back. Give me a moment here. I know this is tedious too. We're all getting to see just how tedious this can be on stream here. The process of putting these back to defaults. Actually, maybe we don't need to, right? Because we're talking about editing custom projections anyway. But on that note, I know this is tedious. I know it's tedious to reset all these. We are planning a part of our next major visual update to resolve this problem, make it a lot easier to reset things to defaults here. So, but let's go ahead and say these are just my custom projections that I uploaded for a handful of players, right? And how does this impact the app overall, right? What we are doing when you are loading custom projections, whether you are loading them or editing them yourself in the app or changing the team totals, is we are simply shifting the player's mean to the new projection, right? So Brandon Woodruff here has a calculated mean projection as the average of all of his simulations of this game of 22.46, right? He has a range of outcomes across all of those simulations that look like this graph. He has some kind of standard deviation and variance and things like that. He's got certain ceiling values and what have you. We are shifting his mean projection by this number. We're shifting his mean projection to this number when you upload a custom projection, and then all of his point values at all these other simulations will be also shifted by the difference. So let me go ahead and see what is 22.46 minus 20.24. 2.22, right? Probably should have just been able to do that in my head. That was actually a pretty simple subtraction problem there, right? So we're going to shift all of his game simulations we have in our database here minus 2.2 points overall. But beyond that, the question here, I think, was about the use of the sliders and SaberSim score. It will really have no other impact on your build, right? meaning that we will still be using smart diversity to use small bins of game simulations to capture a player's real ranges of outcomes and upside and introduce diversity into your builds, right? Just when we bin those simulations to determine a player's projection, we will instead pull the projections that have all been shifted 2.22 down, right? So that is the biggest impact here overall. You're not sacrificing anything. I do see, like in this question, this user said his custom projections that he's loading would be based on a single upcoming game. Maybe he's using raw projections that aren't based on simulations compared to SaberSim projections, which are, of course, based on our simulation base. You are not sacrificing the simulations in any way by uploading custom projections, right? You do shift our projections. You may get a different lineup portfolio. You may get different stacks and pitchers because players that are viable at our projection may not be viable at yours, but you are still leveraging the impacts of the game simulations overall, capturing real ranges of outcome, capturing ceilings, and things like that. So should be all set there, but good question. Okay, cool. Just keep us going here. On to the next question. Same user. This is also from DIY Guy. Another great question. He said, looking back at some results, non-scientific, it seems like a SaberScore in the mid to high 90s doesn't cross the GPP cash line as much as lineups with SaberScores in the mid to high 80s. Thoughts? This is interesting question. I think the note that this is non-scientific, purely anecdotal here, is definitely a pretty sharp point, right? Probably not a sample size large enough for us to determine really scientific conclusions here. But I would say one thing that may be happening there, or is at least something that's kind of interesting to think about, right, is that lineups with a SaberScore of 100 and then the high 90s and things like that, in general, are optimized at winning the contests of the size and type that you selected, right? 10,000 to 50,000 entries is a pretty big contest overall. Alexander here just made it also a really strong point, right? There are more lineups in the 80s than 90s. That is also a really great point. I didn't think about that. That's probably true. Your min cash rate of lineups that are in the 80s is probably higher just because there's more of them. What I was also going to say is that none of these lineups are built to min cash, right? It's kind of a false goal. It would make sense to me that maybe a lineup that is 80 or something overall in its SaberScore. That's interesting that these are a little high. I've seen that before, and I don't know exactly what is causing that, but maybe a lineup that is in the 80s overall has higher min cash equity than a lineup in the 90s, because the goal of these contests and the goal of our lineups is not to min cash. That was kind of another thing I was thinking about. I think it's an interesting overall tool for research. I would be more interested in actually something that I've done before, very briefly, again, not in a very scientific way or in a way that has a very big sample size, is looking at my pool overall. So let's just run a fresh build because it looks like we were getting some weird SaberScores there. But looking at my pool overall, I'm going to run a test build here. And I actually think this is starting to tie into, we had a question from Andrew, and he said, what's the best way to use the All-Star break to evaluate past results? This is one way that I've used review mode before, or the actual score mode, to get an idea of how successful my process is overall. This is something that I think can be kind of useful here. So let me run this build and I'll talk about this a little bit, but obviously you'll need to have contest data to do this. But what I think is very interesting is to, let me show you guys this real quick. So what I will often do is expand this up to 100 and say this is actually my real build that I used last night, right? So you would want to do this for the build that you actually used in your lineups after you've made any adjustments to your projections or anything like that. And I think instead of checking for min cash equity like this user's doing, it's interesting to check for top 1% equity, right? So you can update this here to actual score and see what the highest scoring lineups in your pool ended up being. And I often like to see how many lineups in my entire pool had top 1% equity in the contest overall. So let's say you'll need a contest, right, to do this with. But let's say I was playing like the quarter. This is like a quarter jukebox sized contest. So say there were 15,000 entries in the contest or 20,000 entries in the contest, right? Top 1% is, let's say 20,000 entries in the contest, right? Top 1% is 200. So whatever the 200th person scored, the 200th best lineup, say it was 168, right? Or maybe let's say it was 168. So how many lineups do we have scoring over 168? We had 1, 2, 2, right? So of our pool of 500, we only had 2 lineups here that were in the top 1%. 2 divided by 500, again, I'm going to get exposed for not being able to do math quickly on the fly, is actually only 0.4%, right? So we underscored this contest overall. Now, the conclusions you can draw from that are maybe not super sophisticated for a single slate, right? You lose a lot of slates. That's DFS. But it can be interesting over a longer period of time to go in and track this. And I guess what you are learning here, right, is that if you are finding maybe that you are building pools of lineups, right, full pools, because again, we're looking at 100, but we sorted by actual score. So we're really looking at the best lineups in our entire pool. If you are finding that you have pools of lineups that are outperforming the 1%, say we had 3% of our total lineups scored in the top 1% of the contest. Even if we didn't get to those lineups, right? They were in our pool. The projections that we entered the contest, whether they were default SaberSim or some custom or some lineups with your tweaks, overall outperformed the average, right? And if you're finding over and over again that you are building lineup pools that look like that, but not finding success over a long period of time. Again, I think this experiment would be like something to run for like at least half of a season before you really tried to say, I'm doing something right or doing something wrong. But say you ran this for the second half of the season and found that in general, you outperform the top 1% of lineups in your entire pool, but maybe didn't find a ton of success. What that might indicate to me is that maybe you should pull off the gas pedal a little bit with your editing of exposures if you are doing that, because what you are doing is building fairly strong pools, but somehow in your exposures are not giving yourself access to some of those lineups with that top 1% equity. Vice versa, if you are finding that you are building a lot of pools that are underweight on top 1% equity overall, it may be that if you are editing projections, maybe you are making adjustments that are negative EV, and you should recheck your process of editing projections because the pools overall are lower 1% equity compared to the field, right? Hopefully that wouldn't happen if you were using default SaberSim projections. I think our back testing overall of the model would probably indicate that won't happen. But if you are making adjustments and seeing that kind of thing happen overall, those are kind of 2 ways to maybe back test or check your projection editing projection editing process, versus your exposure editing process, and see how you're doing, right? This is resting on the overall assumption that a perfectly average player over a long period of time, 1% of that player's lineups would show up in the top 1% of their contests, right? That would be perfectly average. You would be exactly meeting expectation. And this is actually a really common idea in the theory of, I'm going to actually, since we've kind of sort of transitioned here to this next question, I'm going to go ahead and put this next question in because I'm kind of now tackling this from the standpoint of testing your results, back testing, and so on, right? This is actually in general a really strong way to overall check your process for GPPs because there's so much variance. It's so hard to win a contest that it's not always very reliable to look at ROI necessarily for a GPP player. this is taking advantage of like finish position as a way of identifying how strong you are as a player, right? If I'm average 1% of my lineups are in the top 1%, if 2% of my lineups are in the top 1%, then really you got to just keep playing. And eventually the variance is going to swing in your favor, right? So this is kind of a way to do that. I think talking about this kind of question of using the All-Star break as a little break, I think it's interesting to go back maybe to some of the recent slates you've played and start looking at this. If you still have the contest information, again, remember, you'll need to pull the actual top 1% score from your contest data and then compare against this. But I had a little spreadsheet I was maintaining for a little while that basically did this, and I was tracking this and found that for the most part, like especially even with minor adjustments overall, that the pool itself in general typically outperforms the top 1% lineup. There'll be 2 to 5%, 2 to 4% maybe on a lot of average slates where even with fairly default settings that the lineup pool is outperforming the expectation of top 1% lineups overall. So we would expect in this particular case to have 5 if we were perfectly average, right? And on this slate, it looked like, again, I actually don't even have a real slate to do this with because I don't know what the top 1% lineup was in a given contest. But say it was 168, I think is the number we were using, right? We only had 2% overall, or we only had 2 lineups. So like 0.4% overall. But anyway, I feel like I've hammered this point home enough. I think that kind of answers 2 questions with 1 stone there. Let me just make sure. I want to make sure that I didn't just gloss over this too quickly. I think I did a good job answering those questions. Let me know if anyone has any follow-up questions on that. I answered kind of 2 questions at once there. I think it's kind of an interesting point. I would say, I guess, while we're talking about this, the one other thing I noted here, Andrew, for this question in particular, and I'm sure you've watched these already. I know a lot of folks out there have, but maybe for the folks that haven't, I think a great way to use the All-Star break to be ready to hit the ground running in the second half of the season is to review some of the strategy sessions and the course on our site. If you haven't already watched that, that is on our site under resources, strategy, baseball, and course, build a winning MLB DFS process. This combined with those 3 videos that we talked about in our strategy sessions for the past 3 weeks. Always good to review, right? I watch a lot of these things on 2x speed on YouTube so I can get through them quickly. Especially these, I've been returning to these over and over again throughout the season. It's easy to fall into traps and bad habits, I think, with DFS. Sometimes it's hard to really kind of stick to your guns and remind yourself, even with contest selection for me, right? Contest selection is a big one for me. I get excited. I look at some of those bigger contests. I start trickling in a little bit more of my bankroll in over half of a season. And then when I kind of stop at the All-Star break and check myself and look back, the biggest thing that I always need to rein in a little bit and tighten up is my contest selection. So, but this, again, circling back here is a good strategy, I think, for some review to actually see, are you building lineups that have top 1% equity? Are you just getting hit by bad variance? Are you failing to build lineups that have top 1% equity, and so on? So, but I'm going to keep us moving because I know we still have plenty of questions to talk about. So let's see. I saw this one just came in. Why is there a difference of players of projected score versus SaberScore ranking? Which metric should one consider? I assume maybe is position in baseball an important feature compared to basketball? Yep. Okay. Yep. So let's talk about this. So first of all, we do allow sorting by SaberScore and projected score, right? So what SaberScore is it is a calculation that uses your given impacts that you've specified with your sliders of correlation, ownership fade, and upside in the form of smart diversity to quantify all of that and give you the best lineup overall that we think takes into account those individual factors, right? We build the lineups. The lineup builder itself builds lineups by using these factors, right? And it builds them one player at a time, and it combines a lineup that has impacts of correlation and ownership and smart diversity, right? But what SaberScore does is it looks at the lineup as it is built as a whole and assigns a score to it and allows us some quality control, some controlling overall for your lineups, and organizes lineups in that form. Projected score, on the other hand, is going to simply just sort by the top projected score lineup overall, right? There's not going to be a significant difference between sorting these things. I would say I would recommend for 90% of the players to use SaberScore. That's what I use. I find it most helpful overall. I think you'll find, again, that if you sort by projected score here, so you see our top SaberScore lineup is only rank 2 anyway, right? It just drops by 1. The top lineups that are showing up are still often going to have a fairly high SaberScore. You are, by sorting by projected score, you are essentially going to maybe have lineups that slightly have higher min cash equity at the expense of their top 1% equity overall. So I think you could justify maybe using projected score sparingly if you are running builds or using slider settings that have maybe higher ownership fade, maybe higher everything, right? Lineup builds that have maybe higher effects of correlation and ownership fade and smart diversity already baked into the build. You could maybe rely on projected score as a way to sort your lineups there after the fact. But neither is really going to have a dramatic effect on your lineup portfolio overall if we even just look at our pitching exposures here, right? So let's look at SaberScore. You can see very minor impacts to the compositions of our lineups overall, but just an alternative for users that want to go that route. I think probably the most compelling case I've heard overall for using projected score in general is that it is static. It's like very, it's very defined, right? A player's projections themselves and the projected scores of lineups don't change build to build. Even though we standardize all builds to have a SaberScore as 100 as the top lineup overall, that calculation is subject to where the sliders are set in general, which vary based on different contests. So I think there's a somewhat compelling case to be made that if you are playing a wide range of different contests and you are playing single entries and 3 maxes and 20 maxes and 150 maxes and satellites and all this different stuff, and you were just doing one build of say 150 lineups and like using our rank fill method to use your top lineup in the first lineup in every contest and your second lineup is the second lineup in every contest, and you're going to have maybe 4x the total bankroll invested to your top, or 10x the bankroll invested to your top lineup than the rest of your lineups in your pool. I can understand an argument to sort by projected score because you are using then this static number that doesn't change build to build based on different settings to decide what your lineup is that gets used in the greatest number of your lineups. I think that's a strong lineup, or I think that's a strong approach. I think that's the most compelling case I've heard to using projected score. But that said, I like to stick to SaberScore. I like knowing that the lineups are being reviewed and quality controlled by the same impacts that they were made from, in the form of correlation and ownership and upside. And that's why I like SaberScore, but that is the difference there. And then I think the second question here was, is position in MLB a important feature compared to basketball? That's kind of a tricky question to answer. I mean, positional eligibility is going to be important in their own rights to every sport that has them. I don't really know the best way to answer that. I would say this: in basketball, I think you can find some leverage on the field by being very tuned into roster construction and what the chalk roster construction is overall on a slate in a way that you can't always do as easily in baseball, right? Like the positions in baseball ultimately at the hitting positions, I think don't matter as much because you're ultimately going to end up using stacks. And I think your bigger concern overall is not who am I playing at third base tonight? It's what are the stacks that are in my lineups, right? And that kind of lowers the weight overall of thinking about how you're building lineups on a slate. And like, I think rarely would I be going into a slate and thinking Devers is the chalky third baseman, right? I think my greater approach would be that looking at across all the positions, right, that Boston is going to be maybe a fairly popular stack, right? In basketball, the caveat is that I think you can think about that roster construction by position a little bit more in an explicit way, right? So if there is a point guard that is min priced that is going to start because somebody got ruled out, like that happens all the time in basketball, that is going to be 60% owned or something like that. Knowing that the chalk construction is going to be a min priced point guard is naturally going to lead you to believe that the spend up positions are going to be forward and center, maybe. This is more true on sites also that have more rigid positional eligibility requirements, right? DraftKings has extremely loose positional eligibility, so this is a little trickier, but on a site like FanDuel, where you do 2 point guards, 2 shooting guards, I can't even remember how it works. It's been so long since I played FanDuel. 2 small forwards, 2 power forwards, and a center, I think is how it works, right? It becomes very easy to know maybe there's 2 really cheap point guards, right? You know very quickly at that point that a lot of money is going to get spent at the forward and center positions or something like that. And I think in that way, positional eligibility can be more important in a sport like basketball. The main way that comes into play in baseball is in terms of a roster construction balance. It's like, how much are you spending on your pitchers versus how much are you spending on your stacks? I think that's the way you could kind of extend this analogy to baseball a little bit. I think the one other thing that's coming to mind here is that there can be at times certain teams that don't lend themselves to stacking well, or they are restrictive to being stacked because they don't deal with certain positions well. So I think positions in general where scoring is generally lower are catcher, second base, and maybe to a lesser extent shortstop. Probably not anymore in 2021. But catcher and second base in general, I think, are typically have lower hitting numbers just in baseball, but also generally lower scoring numbers. If a team's stack does not allow you to get your second baseman or your catcher, I think there is an argument to be made that stack is maybe not as viable, because stacking a team that doesn't allow you to get a catcher and a second baseman means that you are using one-offs at those positions or smaller stacks that are less correlated at positions that have the lowest upside anyway, right? So like thinking about our sliders are truly a scale of, these are like the building blocks that it takes to build a successful lineup. We need this much correlation. We need this much ownership. We need this much upside. And if we reduce the correlative effects of our lineup, or if we reduce the correlative effects of our catcher and second base positions, for example, we theoretically want greater upside to deal with that at those positions. And then those are low upside positions overall, right? So I like having those pieces in my stack when I can find them. But this is really kind of getting into, I think, some more like advanced stuff that, like, I don't even really end up having to think about most of this stuff on the average slate. But on the kind of theory side, I think those are the only other things that are popping into my head. But let's see. I feel like I kind of beat that question to the ground. Nitin, I think, is probably how you pronounce your name, but correct me if I am wrong. Hopefully that was useful to you. And if you have any kind of follow-up questions there, let me know. But I think I kind of covered those in detail here. I saw another question came in from Vincent. And I know if you ask questions in Slack, there are still some questions in my queue. We'll get to everything today. We'll go a little long today. That is no problem. Vincent said, if you feel really good about your process and have the bankroll, would you be maxing out a milli maker? I know it's probably a risk tolerance thing, but as a general thing, Vincent, if you haven't already, I'll plug it again. I would highly recommend checking out this bankroll management and contest selection video. 22 minutes here. I'm going to cover this question here just in a couple minutes, but there's more detail here into maybe why my answer is going to be what it is. I would say, for me personally, I would only be interested in maxing out a milli maker. So let's just say, I think golf has a milli maker this week, right? It's $10, 150 max. I would probably only even consider maxing out that milli maker if I played every single entry, 3 max, 20 max, and 150 max up to the $10 price point, which if you are familiar with the DraftKings lobby, is a lot of bankroll. And even then, I think you could justify paying into contests like the $25 and $50 and $100 and $200 single entries before going into Millie Makers. They're fun as hell. I play a lot of satellites for Millie Maker contests because it's a way to get access to some of those fun contests with crazy upside without committing a ton of your bankroll. But I would say that would be my bare minimum approach. I would not like max out a Millie Maker contest unless I had played basically essentially every single GPP contest up to that dollar point and through that dollar point, right? They're very top heavy. They're very hard to realize your edge if you have one. And they're tough. They can be bankroll killers if you are not very careful about that. Even as a smaller bankroll player, and that's what we really get at in this lesson overall, even as someone that's playing maybe a lot of contests in that under $3 range, the same argument can be made to the mini maxes, right? Those, I think conventional wisdom or what you hear around the industry would say that those contests are soft. They are not. Winning a 150 max 45,000 entry contest is very hard. Those contests actually by entries can sometimes be even harder than the big 150 max contests, the big GPPs up top on any given night. So the same wisdom applies there, right? If you are going to start thinking about maxing out the Millie Maker or the mini max even, I would say you should absolutely be playing everything under that. And in this video, we'll talk about why you should typically be playing over that in the form of single entries and 3 maxes and even some 20 maxes before playing a contest like that. For the average player, right? If you are specifically tuned in to 150 maxes, if you like the idea of playing 150 maxes and having 150 lineups in your portfolio, if you are conservative with your bankroll management strategy overall and can weather the swings that come with those contests, right? There's a lot of reasons to maybe play those, but that is kind of my general answer on that question. I am not maxing out Millie Makers like ever. I'm pretty excited. I think I have 15 or so tickets for this week's golf Millie. That is enough of a rush for me for the Millie up top type contests. And I will stick to things that have a little bit of a flatter structure. So, but good question. All right. Let's see. Another question came in here. I think there's a lot of ways to tackle this. It's kind of a wide open question. And it runs along the same line as what we've been talking about before in terms of kind of like review, using the All-Star break as an opportunity to judge our past results, look at our process overall. But this is from Be More BZ. I assume that's kind of the way that is supposed to be pronounced there as well. But I don't know. It's interesting. I think I would say I'll answer this the same way I did before. And I think what I typically like to do in my process is go back to videos and articles and things like that that are very core to my approach. That includes things that are like this course, right? This course was hugely foundational for me this year, even as somebody that's been playing baseball DFS for years, as kind of thinking about basics of getting back to basics here and building that strong foundation. Those strategy sessions that we've walked through in the past week, being on stream here and walking through those and talking through those with Max has been really helpful, really reinforcing to me. I would definitely recommend going back and watching those. And then, I think apply some of the concepts we talked about before. And I'd be really interested to see like what the results of some of you guys find doing this strategy of looking at past slates, looking at the actual builds you use to enter contests that night, and looking at what your top 1% equity looks like overall compared to the field in your pool, right? Especially if you have, if you've got time, right? This is a manual process. This isn't the easiest thing to do automatically. I will say real quick before I go much further here, we are planning on kind of incorporating some of this more natively into the app in a future update of giving players more bankroll management and like back testing review of your own individual contests. That's something that's on our radar. But for now, this is going to be kind of manual. But we have slates going back, I think, through the full season. If you really want to dig in here and mess with this and see what your top 1% equity looked like in past slates, I think that's a really interesting review process of judging slates. And then maybe even trying some practice builds on past slates, right? Doing a little bit of practice ahead of time. It's only a couple days though, so it'll go fast. I know everyone here on Monday, no baseball slate today is feeling the pain, but it goes pretty fast. So we'll have real slates to talk about here again soon. But let's see. Vincent followed up and said, yeah, I think the latter is me, which is why I want to dabble. I'm super conservative and thought about using it as a lottery ticket. Thanks. Yeah, I would say, honestly, check out the satellites. Like, typically leading into a Millie Maker, DraftKings will post satellites for contests in like every single sport. So we're starting to see some for the week 1 NFL opening night showdown and also the main slate that Sunday. It's July 12th. It started last week, really. Ton of satellites to get tickets for that. And if you are playing those over the course of the next 2 months here, you can rack up a surprising amount of tickets to those contests. They overlay pretty often too, which people don't really feel like I'm giving up some secrets here, but they overlay a lot. They're, I feel like, pretty soft contests to win, even at really low dollar amounts. And you can rack up a lot of tickets and get a little bit of that rush, which is fun, right? I won't be the one to come on here and say like, never play Millie Makers, right? Because they're obviously fun. That's what everyone's dreaming about, is hitting that first place, right? And it's fun when you have some tickets to go in, but it's really draining on your bankroll. So, but anyway. Neaton asked another question. I'm playing DFS in India. We don't have stacks. We only have single and showdown format. Unlike for FanDuel /DK, we don't spend 1.5x, 2x for captain spot. Which slider settings will work for such a format? Honestly, unfortunately, I have doubts overall. That's interesting. Okay. The concern I have here is salary, right? But let's look at like a showdown. Honestly, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, if you don't have the captain spots and the salaries are probably going to be different on whatever DFS site you are playing on, I think what would actually probably be most useful is really just taking advantage of our projections overall. Because I don't think, honestly, you're going to be able to use the builder in a way that builds lineups that are guaranteed to be viable on a site that doesn't have the captain spot and also probably has different player salaries, right? But I think you could still use the projections overall. Obviously, the scoring is probably different on those sites as well, but they are probably similar enough that maybe the projections can still be useful to you. And I would say you could download these and export the projections and use them maybe in a spreadsheet or optimizer that is built to build lineups for whatever site you're playing on. But there's so much difference between pricing and the roster construction overall that I'm not sure if you're going to be able to get a lot of use out of actually using the builder on a different site that we don't support, unfortunately. But I'm going to keep us rolling here. I saw another question come in. Do you find that playing closer to the chalk is the best approach for single entry and 3-max on FanDuel? And will SaberSim incorporate some type of cumulative ownership percentage added into the builder? Two questions here, I guess. And Neaton, I saw you just responded to me, so I'll wrap around back to you here. So yes, I think in general, you need less leverage against the field. You need lower ownership fade for single entries and 3-maxes compared to a 20-max. And that is reflected in our default slider settings, right? So let's say we're just looking at a general contest under 10K people, 1,000 to 10K. You can see that we do get a slight bump to ownership fade. Smart diversity also comes up a little bit, which is also going to provide a form of leverage against the field compared to the single entry or the 3-max lineup. So you need less leverage on the field in these contests, partly because players with only one lineup just play chalkier in general. So minor fades, you get a little bit further. And And then will SaberSim incorporate some type of cumulative ownership percentage added into the builder? We get that question fairly often. I think it's something that we may look at adding in the future. I would say, I know a lot of other optimizers have that. I think that is a little bit, I don't know what the right word is. I don't actually know. I don't want to say, I don't know what anyone that's watching this individual process is. So I don't want to say it's not useful, because I'm sure there are use cases for how it's useful for every individual's process. But I don't think there's a lot of like scientific or mathematical backing for what is useful about that calculation, right? I do think the one thing that can be a little bit more useful is actually a ownership product, right? So instead of a cumulative sum of ownership in your lineup, looking at an overall ownership product can be useful. What that number gives to you, the ownership product of any given lineup multiplied by the number of people in the contest, or the lineups in the contest, is going to tell you in general about how many times you might expect that lineup to be duplicated in the contest, right? So say our total lineup ownership here is typically it's really small, right? But maybe it's like 0.0001, and there are 10,000 people in the contest, right? That's going to mean that that's probably going to be a one lineup in that contest that is that lineup, right? And that can be a very good way, especially for things like showdowns and things like that, where there are a lot of duplicates. It can be useful to see about how many times your lineup is going to be duplicated. So I think that's useful. Marcus says it helps with seeing that number in regards to how the slider's working. Get what you're saying, though. Thanks. Yeah, I will say, so another request we hear pretty often is more visibility in what the individual components of a lineup are that are leading to the SaberScore, right? Like what are the quantified impacts of correlation and ownership on this lineup, right? And what's maybe two lineups with very similar SaberScore. One is very nicely correlated and one has a lot of ownership fade, and maybe there's a reason you want to use one of those or the other. More visibility into how SaberScore is being calculated overall is something that we I think definitely want to implement in a future update. And maybe that does come in the form of just a simple ownership sum, right? Because it's a very easy calculation for it to make. And again, I definitely don't want to say that there's no use case for that calculation, because everyone's process is different, and I'm sure there's a useful way to use an ownership sum for a lot of you out there. So, but Neaton said, we do have captain and vice captain spot. Captain gets 2x points and vice captain gets 1.5 points. Salary are somewhat similar to FanDuel. Yeah, I don't know how useful the builder's still going to be, just because it's not, I just don't think it's similar enough. Or is it? MVP. Oh yeah, actually it might work. Does anyone know? MVP I think is 2x and star is 1.5. So it sounds like maybe they're just copying FanDuel, right? In that case, if that is true, if you have these captain and vice captain and the salaries are similar enough to FanDuel, I would say you could at least experiment with using the FanDuel single game builder to build lineups. So from there, I would say start with default. I think the original question was about sliders. Start with default sliders that fit your contest, right? So if we were playing this and maybe you're building one lineup and there's, I don't even know how many people are in these contests, but maybe there's, say, 500 or something like that. Start with the default sliders for your given contest size and then build, right? Let's say we're building 20 lineups or something like that. You can go ahead and build. And again, unless salaries are like very, very, very close, you might get invalid lineups, but it should work. And you probably have a bunch of edge on the field, to be completely honest, because I imagine there's not a lot of other people on these sites that are using a method as sophisticated as SaberSim here to build lineups. So hopefully that helps. Follow up with me if that is working. Maybe there's a little edge there. I wonder if I could VPN into the Indian DFS sites and find a little edge, because probably There probably is some. Probably not a lot of people using simulation-driven projections to build their single game lineups on those sites. So, cool. I'm gonna just keep rolling. I know we're 15 minutes over or so today, but we're getting a lot of questions. That's awesome. I'm gonna just keep it rolling. So, Marcus followed up here, said little off the beaten path, but what's your thoughts on Gallo at MVP tonight and to win? Gallo, is there a home run derby contest on DraftKings? I was just gonna take the night off, to be honest. I don't know, like, how people are coming up with their home run derby projections. I've seen a few out there. To me, it seems like a total sweat, right? And that's great. Drink a couple beers, watch the home run derby, have something on it to sweat a little bit. If you are doing that, is one on FanDuel. That's pretty cool. I may have to check that out. Yeah, I was planning on taking the night off. I don't think there's going to be a ton of edge in either home run derby, DFS, or sports betting. I see the markets have been moving like crazy on the, especially the Shohei to win bets, right? The markets come down to like plus 200 on him. But I don't think there's a ton of edge there. I think it's fun to sweat. If you're looking for like my gut call, I like Perez. Dude hits bombs, right? Again, this is total gut. There's not going to be any mathematical basis for this or whatever. I don't think I haven't seen anyone once pick Perez today. And I like him. Hits the ball hard. Anyone can win tonight. But that's kind of like, if I was just going to throw a little bit on it to watch and enjoy it, I would probably bet Perez. So, partly I guess there's a little bit of that because like I think Ohtani at this point is going to be, and I don't know what the pricing looks like on this FanDuel contest you're talking about, but for the sports betting side of it or the prop betting side or whatever, Ohtani's like plus 200 has gotten kind of ridiculous. I think I see a lot of Matt Olson love. I think Trevor Story, since he's playing in Coors, someone's going to have some narrative there to maybe bump him up a little bit. Soto, it's almost like process of elimination, right? Soto's crazy popular. I think he's going to end up drawing some ownership. And then Alonso, having won it last year, I think is also going to be like a pretty popular bet overall in a game that I think ultimately is like an 8-way coin flip, the way I think about it. So give me the guy that no one is talking about is basically like as sophisticated as my approach is. So, but I'm going to bounce over here to Slack real quick. I still see there's some more conversation going on in YouTube. I just want to make sure I get to this question. This came in from Spoke in Boston, and he said, not related to the software, but would like your thoughts on whether you think streaks, individual or team, has a place or should even be considered in lineup decisions. I understand that this is not predictive or even quantitative statistic, but perhaps psychologically it could mean that a hot player would be more likely to achieve his projected median than a cold player. I think you pretty much nailed it here, actually. I think there's a lot of data out there that says that hot streaks don't really exist either for teams or players. So it does not factor into my process whatsoever. It's definitely not really in line with like SaberSim's approach overall to lineup building. I think that's very narrative driven. We take a very data driven approach to our projections and process overall. I think it was Nate Silver's book that I actually read this. The Signal and the Noise came out in like 2012 or whatever, but really good book. Really interesting from Nate Silver, who's the guy behind 538. If you're not familiar with him, does a lot of politics and sports predictive and statistical analysis and things like that. And he talks about in that book a simulation experiment that was done. Basically, I think it might have been baseball, actually. I think it's baseball hits is what the experiment was. And basically taking the wealth of past data that we have for hitting in baseball and running, well, we have a control experiment, right, where we assume that hot streaks don't exist, and then actually building a simulation-based model that does account for hot and cold streaks. Basically, if a player had, I think what they did is if a player had two consecutive hits, they were more likely to get another hit, right? Their odds in the simulation engine to get a hit went up, and then stacked from there. And then they ran that simulation, right? And the live data, the real world data that we have actually better fits a simulation engine not built on hot or cold streaks, right? I'm not saying this in a very articulate way, unfortunately. I'm trying here. But basically that, like, if you actually build an engine that takes into account the impacts of hot and cold streaks, you model the real world data that we have worse than without it. So I think that was probably the most like compelling reason I've ever read here about why that's not something that you should be taking into account. I know there's all kinds of stuff out there, especially from like past players on social media, that always say like, hey, you don't get it unless you were out on the field. But hot and cold streaks totally exist. I don't know. Not something that factors into my process. And I wouldn't recommend it. I would say maybe the only thing, I always like to come back with this rather than saying just like no. I always like to maybe come back with a little bit of nuance or maybe where there's an exception. If there are other stats supporting that maybe the player is underpriced, right? Let's talk about DFS here for a moment. If there are other stats to indicate that maybe a player is underpriced for something that has changed, that's where it gets really interesting, right? If a pitcher added velocity to his fastball and added a new pitch to his arsenal over the offseason and, sorry about that, and starts the season at 7,500 average salary and pitches 5 great games or something like that, or even like 2 great games, right? It doesn't have to be a very big data sample. If there's a reason to think, okay, that player may be underpriced because something has changed, right? I think that's something where you could conventionally be like, this pitcher's hot. He's striking everybody out. And I don't like that line of thinking. But if you're looking at it instead from the standpoint of something about this situation has changed and the sites are improperly accounting for that, that's where I think that gets interesting. Of like, there's actually, I think, some more scientific background there, and probably something that lends some opportunities for individual research. That's something that maybe models just in general don't take into account very well. That's interesting. But, Steph Curry scored 40 points in 3 straight games. I'm not buying like the play him in 4th game, like, or the Schwarber drama that was going on a couple weeks ago, right? Like, personally, I'm not buying any idea that he's like hot and has a better likelihood to have another good game in a row. So just my take here. So I think I got pretty much everything. I see a couple other comments. Absolutely true. They are copying. Yeah, I definitely know there's a market out there for like international DFS, and most of those sites just copy the exact salaries that either DraftKings or FanDuel use and put out their own contests for them. Even Fantasy Draft from a couple years ago. I don't know if anybody played too much on Fantasy Draft, but they just used literally exactly what, like, they use different numbers, but the overall proportion of salary for each player to the salary cap was exactly the same as DraftKings, and you could just build lineups for DraftKings. That would sometimes work on that site. So, but let's see. I think I got everything. Thank you guys for making this such an awesome office hours here today. I'm always happy to stay a little long where it makes sense and dive into some of these questions as they are coming up. Getting an hour and 22 minutes or so out of a day where we have no baseball main slate to play at all is pretty awesome. So I will go ahead and start to close us out there. I will remind everyone, first of all, that we are back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the All-Star game, maybe a little bit. Talk maybe a little bit about the home run derby. Maybe start thinking about the Open Championship for golf. It's a major week here for golf, even though we're not playing any baseball. That is always fun. Or really, again, whatever you guys always want to talk about. If you come up with questions overnight tonight or into tomorrow morning and want them to be answered on stream, pop them into the Office Hours channel on Slack. Email us, support@sabersim.com. We will get to everything. Reminder too, before I hop off, that we will be doing a strategy session this week on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern for MLB showdowns in preparation for the return of baseball on Thursday with the Red Sox and Yankees showdown. So should be a lot of fun. Have fun with any sweats or bets you've got going on for the Home Run Derby tonight. Enjoy it. And I will see you guys all here again tomorrow. Take care.